I think that skin has some of the easiest techniques to learn, so I hope that this video is helpful and the tips that I give you can take away and add that to your painting of skin. First, I'll start with a sketch. I highly recommend doing this because if you don't, you'll end up juggling too many things at the same time, especially if you're new to art. It just clears your mind a bit while you're painting. Don't need to worry as much about the positioning and proportions. While I'm sketching, I flip the canvas over horizontally, the big tip, because for some reason our eyes are wonky and we tend to draw things leaning towards one side. So you can see there I just flipped it, and when you flip it you can kind of easily see the mistakes that you make and correct them. The second big tip is to use reference. For most people this might not be a tip, just something that you already do, but I remember when I started I did not realise that everyone uses it. The second step is a base colour. Use a brush which has a hard middle but a soft edge, so you can blend and actually put something down. If you use a brush that's too soft or has too low opacity, you won't be able, it'll be frustrating to put anything down, it won't build up very fast, and if you use a brush that has too hard edges, then it'll be hard to blend. Each base has a slightly different colour and value, and it just depends on your reference. Study your reference, look at your reference, and try and pick the mid-tone, or at least the majority colour. Every reference different, you'll have your own challenges in each one, but you'll see soon that each portrait I paint has a different base colour. Some are leaning towards red, some are leaning towards yellow, and some are leaning more towards orange, and has a different value. Some values are changed because of the lighting, each reference has a different lighting, but it doesn't matter, don't worry too much about which colour you pick, just put one down that you think is right, not too dark and not too bright, just right. Step 3 is the shadow. What I mean by shadow is kind of the base shadows, so it's the overall shadow. I'm starting to build it up. Do not worry about perfecting the shadow. In this stage, you are just trying to put in a base and you build it up later, so do not worry about making it exact to the reference. Just kind of to show that there is some shadow there, pay attention to the colour, and just try and start the shadow. I often see in people's portraits, in the skin particularly, very, very muddy colours. You want to use desaturated colours, that's what makes it look muddy, but you also want to use it with saturation at the same time. If you look at your reference, if you have one up now, you'll probably notice that in the shadow specifically, there are some colours which are desaturated, so they're leaning towards the left side of the hue cube, but there also in the shadow are some very high saturated shadow colours, and they are harder to spot in the shadow because they can be very dark, but without them the whole piece will look very muddy, so use a balance. It depends on what your reference is. If you've got a reference with a very bright light, like a very bright coloured light, then it will distort your colours, so I would recommend practicing with a natural light, and then you can move on and look at ones with the bright neon lights, something like that. With every step, except for this, actually the sketching as well, I work from biggest to smallest. So by that I mean, if I'm sketching, I sketch an overall shape first, so kind of the overall biggest shape, or the most kind of So if I'm drawing a face, I might start with an oval because that is kind of the overall shape, the biggest shape. I wouldn't just start with the nose, if you know what I mean. When I'm same as when you're painting, you want to start with the overall shadow and the overall highlight. You don't want to work into a small area at one time. You want to work into it overall and then work into those small areas later. Fourth step is the highlight. By this, again, I mean the overall. I'm just starting to put in what I think is the largest part of the highlight. I'm not caking it on all at once. I guess I'm just trying to build it up and take time to make it brighter over time rather than just putting it all on at once. I don't just work into the highlight in this step, I also work into the shadows a bit more and put more down, because once you put the highlight on you can kind of see, oh yeah, this shadow's not quite dark enough in relative to it. Again, do not worry about getting the exact colour, the exact value to the reference you're using, as long as everything looks good relative to each other on your painting. So if you have a slightly lighter shadow and mid-tone, you might have a slightly lighter highlight than your reference, but try and keep it close. In this section I also work into the shadow a bit more with more saturation, and also between the shadow and the highlight, keeping that a balance so it doesn't look muddy. You often see in references that there's quite high saturation between a shadow and a highlight, depending on what the lighting is like, but it's also quite aesthetically pleasing, so I often put a bit more saturation in places that I already can see the saturation, just to heighten it a bit more. I think lips count as the skin, so I again start with a base and I work into it with more shadow and highlight and overall. Don't get carried away on the lips, it's easy with the highlights that you find on the lips. Don't just put the brightest highlight on and then work, because you end up trying to work around it and it'll just get in the way. So just go again just from, I like to say biggest to smallest, but it's hard to explain, it doesn't exactly explain it right, but just the overall to the details later. Every portrait will have a slightly different way of painting it. So, for example, in the bottom left portrait that I'm painting, the contrast between the shadow in the face specifically and the highlight is not as great as the other portraits that I'm painting, but it's still there and it still makes a massive difference in showing the skin and the forms. So just pay attention. If it's not much contrast, it can be difficult spotting where the highlight and the changes of value are, but they are there. In the bottom right one, it's very bright compared to the other portraits. It's a mixture of just a brighter skin tone and also the reference had a brighter light. So my mid-tone started a lot brighter than the others because it was the overall tone of value of that portrait in particular. Next, I start with a build-up 1, step 5. By that I kind of mean what we've done already, but building it up even further. So the build-up sections take a bit longer than the last two, especially this one because it's usually the biggest change. I'm really just, again, focusing on the values and colour and trying to work into it. Try and look, is this part dark enough? Is this part light enough? Spot where you think there could be more depth, because without the contrast it would be hard to show. And that's why the bottom left one is the most challenging, because there isn't as much contrast in the skin. I'm also working into the eyes, otherwise I find it distracting from the skin, but I won't be doing a tutorial on eyes. But a quick tip on the colour in the not the pupils, the eyeball colour, I guess, the whites, is that I often notice that they aren't grey. I started off with grey, but I work into it a bit more with some warmer tones. They often have a slightly leaning toward orange or yellow, but they are pretty desaturated, the whites in the eye. And don't try not to make them too bright. They're usually close to the mid-tone. They might have brighter parts, and they might be a bit brighter than the mid-tone, depends on what you choose at the beginning. But they are not too bright. If they're too bright, they kind of look like you've whitened your eyes, which is not a good idea. I want to explain this tip that I always use when I'm painting skin. I'm always thinking about this, and it's something that I learned quite recently in this year, I think, and it's to do with the hue cube and how the saturation and the value interact or change. So I'll do an example. When you go to the middle of the value on the hue cube, so the middle grey on the left, if you travel right, the value isn't staying the same, it's actually getting darker. Typically when your colour gets more saturated, it also gets darker, and that's really important when you paint skin, because say if you have a highlight or a tone in the skin that is less saturated, and then you want to put another colour next to it which is very saturated but a similar values, then if you go straight to right on the hue cube, then the value will get darker, and if you put that on the skin, it will stand out and look too dark. So it's very important to know that, because you can always try and guess a lot easier what that value is going to be if you know that when you go right on the hue cube, it's going to get darker as well. A big thing in painting skin with reference is trying to tell what colour is what. So when you look at a colour, is it an orange or a red, or on what scale, which orange and red it is, and it's very difficult to see. I don't think, maybe some people get it exactly, and you want it to get it as close as possible. It doesn't matter if it's not exact, but you do want to make it look right. And I've found that the only way to learn how to tell what a colour is or whereabouts this colour is on the hue cube is really just to paint a lot of faces. I find the best teacher for this, because there's so much colour in faces, especially skin. So sadly I can't explain how to see a colour. It's just something that is just gonna be learned over time. I'm just working into it a bit more still. I'm just gonna let the video go for a bit until we get to the next stage, because this stage is the biggest. Like I said, the build up takes quite a long time, but I hope that you can observe how I'm building it up. It's hard to put in words, if I'm honest, but just make sure you're looking at your reference, and just try and identify where you think it should be darker and where you think it should be lighter, and where you think there should be less saturation and where you think there should be more saturation. I do start to work into the painting with a hard brush in some parts, mostly in the eyes, not so much in the skin. Maybe in the skin when it comes to near the hairline, but I don't use a hard brush on cheeks and stuff like that. Maybe in the eyebrows, either showing the eyebrow or the skin in the eyebrow, and I do sometimes use a hard brush in the nostrils, not all the way around, just kind of at the top, and then leave the bottom of the dark shadow soft, because if it's just a hard edge all around it, it kind of sticks out a bit too much. Another tip on painting nostrils is not always like this in the reference, but it's kind of aesthetically pleasing, is to make a quite high saturated, usually red or kind of orange tone in the nostrils, and I see a lot of people do that and it just looks quite good, so you can play around with that. The next step and last step is build up to, and in this section it's pretty much looking good. I just go in and kind of clean things up. I go in with the hard brush in the hair and things like that, but in the skin I do use a little bit of an airbrush, but I don't like using too much because I like it when there are some texture in the skin, but sometimes there's a bit too much texture, so sometimes you can see where I've made brush strokes a bit too much and there's a bit too much shape, so I like to just blend it out a little bit, but not completely. It's up to you how much you want your skin to be blended, but I like the overall painterly style. A highlight to watch out for is that highlight under the chin, so you can see in some of these portraits there are some highlights that happen, or some reflective light happening, and it kind of sits on the chin or on the jaw. If you leave that out, it can make your portrait look flat, depending on whether the reference of the lighting has that. So keep an eye out, because it's quite easy to miss, and sometimes it's quite subtle as well. So just keep keep an eye out for that pesky highlight on the jaw or on the chin. When painting lips, you want to be careful when you're putting the highlights on. You want to make them soft, but you don't want to put too much. When I paint the highlight on the skin, I really try to do it in a few strokes. It does depend on the reference, but because I want it to have a bit of texture and to have a bit of gaps where the shadow is coming out, because if you look at lips, they usually have kind of a bit of lines or gaps between each highlight, but at the same time you don't want it to look too harsh on the edges, so make sure you take extra time to paint that highlight on the lips, and then you start with the overall highlight like I mentioned before, and then you can move into the brightest highlights on the lips, and you can slightly go a bit harder edge with your brush and work into it with a brighter highlights after you've done an overall highlight. Otherwise it will look like there's something sitting on the lip rather than the highlight on the lip. I also like to use interesting brushes sometimes, and don't overuse them, specifically on the skin, because they all stand out a lot. But I like to use like a rake brush or a oil texture brush a bit on the skin, maybe on the edges. I haven't that much in this demonstration, but play around with it. I've used a bit of a rake, but it's very subtle. I like to use a rake specifically between shadow and highlight, but subtly, just to create a bit of variety and painterly look. on the portrait and on the skin. Here's the finished portraits. You can see each one is different skin tone and different values, which I like practicing. Each one had their own different challenges, so I recommend doing 5 like I've done, or more. At least 3, I would say. Try and choose like different ones. I could have chosen a bigger range,